We started 4 years ago now. My kind of background from DeepMind can kind of lead up to that story. So, you know, we started out trying to bring a lot of the early DeepMind models into Google products like search, YouTube, cloud, ads, and everything else. And we saw very quickly that a lot of it was flowing into enterprise applications rather than to consumer. And so, the founding team, my co-founders and I were inspired to say, how can we basically make sure that the benefits and magic of AI actually reach consumers at the end of the day? Because we've always believed that the most value and benefits of AI will accrue when they kind of touch everybody's daily lives and not necessarily just professional facing applications.
Yeah, this is so interesting. I think Inworld has gone through a lot of very big releases with NVIDIA, with Microsoft, and has been one of the stars in like a gaming AI space over the last 2 years. And personally, I am a big fan of gaming. I have been kind of playing when I was a child, and as now I get to startup, it's getting harder, but yeah, still I try to constantly buy out all the different game devices and test out how it experience and imagine how the future look like when it's like AI co-living with human. So the first question I'm curious is you started from gaming and you use a lot
Mhm.
of mind technology there.
Yeah.
How do you decide to broaden up to generic consumer sector and empowering other consumer startups?
Yeah, so I'll tell you the full story. So basically, because as I alluded to, so when I was at DeepMind, after the GPT-3 launch, there was a kind of big push to figure out how we bring generative models into different Google products. And so, we had very cool early conversations around what search would look like, when it was AI native, which took until Google I/O this year to actually happen. What would YouTube, learning, all these different areas. And what ended up happening was so much of our work ended up in certain Google Cloud applications, things like contact centers and certain professional facing applications. And they have continued to kind of see that momentum, continuing. So, you see most of the big AI companies that you see are professional facing or are developer tools themselves. If you look at the App Store, though, there's very few new companies on there that have actually created something AI native. Like ChatGPT for sure is on the top there, but there's very few. Like if you look at the top 100 list, it's not that dissimilar from what it was, 10 years ago or 5 years ago. Um, and so when we first started out, we recognized based on those learnings from DeepMind and Google that conversational AI was clearly something that the current generation of models were really good at. And so we were looking at that, the capabilities of the model, as well as kind of the growing space here in gaming and media. And so we just started basically like, well, there's a very clear gap there, which is, whether there's these virtual worlds. This was just before Meta did their announcement. You have this idea of these characters in metaverse, of course, which had become a dirty word, but the metaverse. And of course, in gaming itself, anybody who's played a game realizes that there's a lot more life that can be brought there. Like of course, the fidelity and graphics and everything else have evolved. And so, yeah, we started working with, Xbox, Disney, NVIDIA, Niantic, all these different groups to figure out basically how to build these applications. And the reason it was such a good place to start is one, games have some of the highest technical and creative bars that you can imagine. Everything's got to be happening in, under 500 milliseconds. You've got to have super low cost because you have a lot of users. You've got to be integrated with a bunch of systems. You got to make a lot of stuff run on device. And so it kind of like, let's say, sharpened our tools a lot. And we kind of helped to kind of pioneer, I think, a lot of the ideas of even how player-facing AI would feel in games. And so the transition came is like, as we were working with these large category leaders in gaming and media, we built actually the core infrastructure for ourselves to kind of accelerate our work with them. And that was mainly just built as internal tooling that we had initially, built to kind of accelerate our own work. But then we started getting inbound from a lot of other broader consumer applications, health, fitness, language learning, and broader groups. And what we realized is kind of the infrastructure that we built to serve our own problems basically solve the same problems that all the other consumer builders were facing. And so those were kind of that was kind of the aha moment for us, was when we were like, oh, well, we have this, we had a prior generation of products that were very focused on gaming. Actually, the infrastructure that we built was the most valuable thing. And that was because it solved like the three core problems, at least, that we see kind of blocking consumer AI adoption today. So the first is like the gap between prototype to production. You can stand up a demo very quickly. Everybody knows that they can vibe code something over a weekend, but getting that to get like ready to manage performance at like multi-million user scale is super hard. So you'd build a prototype in a week, and then you spend 6 months basically actually getting it ready for production. And that kind of pace kills a lot of projects. And so we, of course, face that, but we saw that also in a lot of consumer facing applications. The next one is how much resource allocation are you actually putting into net new product development? So what we saw is when teams go through a launch, and I've also talked to other groups, early mobile games and that places like Zynga, where after they went through a launch, almost the entire team for the next 6 months was on like bug fixes and maintenance, which kind of pulls you away from that new product development. And so we wanted to figure out a way to basically automate a lot of the maintenance and updates so that you could push that time onto net new product development. And then the third one was this idea of experimentation. So games are very interesting because you have two different approaches to games. You have the mobile games, which are very experimental. If you talk to anyone who's doing anything in the mobile space, like things like Candy Crush, they're hyper focused on personalization and they run tons of experiments. When you talk to people in kind of the AAA space, it's much more monolithic. They do a single launch and it's locked in at a certain date. So there's much less opportunity for experimentation. And so we worked with a lot of those bigger partners to kind of introduce that idea of experimentation. But of course, that's something that's super valuable. And we can talk about, your experience there on personalization and consumer apps and how much like experiments that needs. And so we also designed a way to be able to launch and scale hundreds of experiments in parallel without doing code changes. Because if you have to go through a code change for every experiment, you're waiting weeks between each one. So that's kind of like the problems that we saw that we were facing, but also broader consumer AI builders are facing, which basically pushed us to productionize our internal infrastructure as a new product, which we're launching today.
Yeah, cool. That's really interesting. Maybe let me add a bit about my background since we actually talked in AGI House briefly, but I never really introduced what I'm doing, why I'm like actually interested in consumer. Actually, I was also from Google DeepMind. At that time, it's called Google Brain. 2016, I was Stanford AI PhD. I was actually the first math PhD who studied like deep learning and decide, okay, I want to understand what's the math behind deep learning. And unfortunately, today I don't understand fully what's the math behind deep learning, but I stumbled upon, the discovery of transformer in 2016 summer, where we find like a self-attention is actually better than bidirectional LSTM sequence models. And I'm the first person who get that like a self-attention model to work on question. Basically, just replace like English to French translation into a question plus context as the input and the answer as the output. That's like my first stumble onto like a consumer stuff AI. And I built this AI stuff and realized, okay, if I cheat by like instead of only like fighting the benchmark with Wikipedia, if I just continuously adding the infinite basically Google like a consumer user search query data on like the Google inner like search database, I can basically scale crazy and without changing a single line of the model code. Like by increased data size, the performance gets like crazy good because like Google has such good data on like everyone's search and like knowledge queries. And that's the first time I see the power of kind of this like consumer attention market that like Google was basically monopolizing. And over there, I first of all realized, okay, as if I want to do a startup, I'll probably not do anything in consumer space. It's kind of scary how much data Google actually about each user. Second is I realized, okay, as a mathematician, it's actually not very feasible to use like a mathematical series to understand the deep learning since it's fundamentally a very empirical science. We jump on to use model to do some application. So I spent a lot of time in like financial space. I did like a lot of algo trading, which is kind of like a gameplay in this very abstract, like multiplayer game fashion that people just want to beat each other on like predicting the market and predicting other events. And it's like a very high stake gambling game that people just like play millions of dollars on like ideations and on like market movements. And it's also very multimodal, right? Like every agent is pretty much like RL agent that maximizes their reward subject to a bunch of like probabilistic constraints. And it's something that you cannot even build a perfect simulator with because like there is counterfactual things but there is also effect that you cannot model, like when one market maker trades a lot, so it will trigger other market makers to react to it. There's a lot of this interesting kind of effect. So it's in effect for like a professional players, a very big
Yeah.
game. And I've been playing that after PhD for 3 years. I managed around $1 billion. And then, of course, I see ChatGPT. And at that moment, I realized, okay, what we did in research is now crossing the bar to like be applicable for consumer. But I don't know what to build. So for the first year when I leave and do startup, I built this company, Generative Alpha. So Gen Alpha is basically a trading AI company where my mission is to build basically the best agentic trading system that combines the best of like quant trading and the best of like the human traders like Soros, Ray Dalio, and like basically mimic how they make decisions, which is massively different from the quant trading models. And so far we have getting pretty good return in the real world Nasdaq gambling game. I've been made 100% return up myself,
Wow.
like over the last probably 9 months. So like decent in terms of the performance outcome.
Yeah.
And yeah, that company I'm now like also building this kind of, you can call it like a very abstract game engine, but it's more like I build a money system and exchange for like future agents. Imagine you can essentially interact with a abstract exchange in like your cloud code, where you can tell it basically vibe coding and tell it to move money from some exchange to on-chain to like some interactive broker or like Goldman's primary broker account. That's thing we are working on. Essentially, give every retail the capability of like play like a Citadel portfolio manager. And fast forward in like when I do that company for a year, the first thing we build is analyst AI. So I kind of use the analyst AI to essentially build something more like a deep research version of Perplexity that is more focused on finance and do like deep question on finance. And I realized, oh, consumer is so hard. When I look at what Perplexity do, I was like, wow, it's all about customer acquisition, and it's all about like there's like experiments, like this basically understanding what consumer wants. And yeah, like in real world, the most expensive thing is basically attention, traffic, eyeball, right? And the channels, all these channels are crazy expensive.
Yeah.
And then it leads me to have this idea about Ping AI, where let's like be hyper personalized and enable everyone to basically like basically create a self-custody data wallet that pull over all of their data from different big techs like Google, Facebook to themselves, and build the version of like data in today's world more like everyone's personal MCP about themselves in like all different dimensions about how they trade, how they eat, yeah, like what kind of shopping behavior they are, and all this, so that we fully understand this user. And yeah, like I also spend a lot of time thinking about how we can enable every personal agent to interact in a gaming world. That's why when we talk in AGI House, I was immediately pretty hyped about what Inworld. And I was like, okay, if we plug this, we know user very well. We have like luckily the trust from user to have like
Yeah.
personal data. And if we can have this like game engine style multiplayer world, it's easy to imagine we might enter the next phase of like how human and AI co-live beyond this.
Yeah.
Like trading system is today's like an example of like human and AI co-live, right? Like
Yeah.
go to Nasdaq, a lot of your trading counterparty is already algos that do not belong to some human. Yeah, but in the real world where like consumers have fun, all the world is kind of like designed for real person, right? There is like a Cloudflare that try to like basically ban agents from like interacting with these apps. And yeah, the whole like advertisement system, no matter impression ads or conversion ads, is all geared towards a human eyeball. But I believe in the future it's going to be like either human eyeball or personal agent, or even some agent that do not belong to some person. And in that world, I can totally imagine there is a base infrastructure
Yeah.
that is kind of very similar to a massive multiplayer game simulation engine today.
Yeah, yeah. So it's interesting when you think about like kind of to your point there, like consumer is hard. And we kind of maybe like what you also said about Google is interesting, which is like I think people have kind of accepted that consumers hard. Like even if you talk to a lot of investors on that, people have been kind of scared to step into the space. And what I think is changing right now, though, is you have a lot of these companies who have been around for a very long time in consumer. If you know your top ones, you've got your top language learning apps like Duolingo, you got your top fitness apps like Strava. You know, you've got basically your category leaders haven't changed a lot. And I know we can see, for example, of course, you know, Spotify, Duolingo, all these companies are trying to shift towards a more AI native approach. And a lot of them actually have, you know, a background in that. So I think there is a question of like how quickly can they move to properly